By the spring of 1945, the Waffen-SS numbered close to 900,000 men under arms. They held divisions in Hungary, in Pomerania, in the ruins of the Ardennes, in Courland, in Austria, and inside the shrinking ring around Berlin. They were the largest force of their kind in modern European history. Within a single year, they had functionally disappeared. Some had died in the final convulsions of the fighting. Others passed into Allied custody and were processed through camps that left only fragmentary paperwork behind. Tens of thousands more were taken into Soviet captivity and were not seen again for a decade, in some cases longer. A smaller number, never large but persistent in post-war legend, were never accounted for at all. The story of where those 900,000 soldiers went is one of the most documented and at the same time most distorted chapters of the years that followed the end of the war. If you find historical investigations like this one worth your time, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so the next episodes find you when they go live. Your support is what keeps this kind of long-form research possible. With that said, let us begin. To understand the scale of the disappearance, you first have to understand what the Waffen-SS actually was by 1945. The organization had begun in the mid-1930s as a small armed wing of the Schutzstaffel, with no more than a few thousand men in its earliest formations. It was conceived as a paramilitary force loyal to Hitler personally, rather than to the German state or to the regular army of the Wehrmacht. Its expansion in the late 1930s was modest. Its explosive growth came after the invasion of Poland and especially after the campaign in France in 1940. By the time the war reached its midpoint, the Waffen-SS had been transformed. What had been a hand-picked guard force became a parallel army. Recruitment opened first to other Germans outside the original racial criteria, then to ethnic Germans living in Eastern Europe, the so-called Volksdeutsche, and finally to foreign volunteers from across occupied and Allied Europe. By 1944, divisions of Dutchmen, Flemings, Walloons, Danes, Norwegians, Frenchmen, Latvians, Estonians, Bosnian Muslims, Ukrainians, Cossacks, Albanians, and Italians were fighting under Waffen-SS command structure. The original ideological screening had collapsed under the pressure of casualties. By 1945, the force was multinational, multilingual, and worn thin. The figure of 900,000 is itself imprecise. Different German records give slightly different totals. The most often cited number, drawn from post-war reconstruction by historians including Bernd Wegner and George Stein, places peak strength at somewhere between 830,000 and 950,000 in the first months of 1945. What is certain is that this was a much larger organization than most readers imagine when the term Waffen-SS is used in popular culture. It was not a small elite. It was a sprawling military formation with 38 numbered divisions, some at full strength, others little more than paper formations of a few thousand half-trained men. When the collapse came, it came everywhere at once. In Hungary, the last great Waffen-SS offensive, Operation Spring Awakening, broke against Soviet defenses in March of 1945. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which contained some of the most experienced formations of the war, fell back through Western Hungary into Austria with its strength halved and its fuel reserves nearly gone. In Pomerania and East Prussia, other SS divisions disintegrated under Soviet pressure during February and March, their survivors mixing with refugee columns moving west. In the west, the divisions that had fought in the Ardennes and around the Rhine were ground down by April. By the time Berlin fell at the start of May, what remained of the Waffen-SS was no longer a coherent military organization. It was a series of pockets, columns, and isolated formations moving in whatever direction offered the best chance of surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. That preference, the desire to surrender westward, would shape almost everything that followed. SS men who had served on the Eastern Front knew what Soviet captivity was likely to mean. Many divisions made forced marches of hundreds of kilometers in the final weeks of the war for the single purpose of reaching American or British lines before the surrender took effect. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and several others moved through Austria toward American forces. Several made it. Others did not. The Totenkopf reached American lines near Linz in early May and surrendered, only to be handed over to the Soviets within days under the terms of the Allied agreements. Most of those men disappeared into the Soviet camp system. Only a fraction came back, and most of those not until the mid-1950s. The mass surrender that followed Germany's capitulation on May 8, 1945, was the largest in military history. Across all branches of the German armed forces, somewhere between 8 and 11 million men passed into Allied custody in a matter of weeks. The Waffen-SS made up a significant fraction of this total, but were not separated out in the initial chaos. Men in field grey uniforms with the SS runes on their collars were processed alongside Wehrmacht infantry, Luftwaffe ground personnel, Volkssturm conscripts, and police battalions. Records from those first weeks are notoriously incomplete. Camps were improvised in fields, in former barracks, in the open along the Rhine. The Americans called the largest of these the Rhine Meadow Camps, the Rheinwiesenlager, and at their peak they held more than 1 million prisoners in conditions that historians still argue about today. Within those camps, the screening process began. Allied intelligence officers were under instructions to identify members of the SS and separate them from the general prisoner population. The most obvious marker was the blood group tattoo, the small mark inked under the left arm of Waffen-SS members from 1940 onward. Allied screeners learned to check for it. Many SS men learned to burn it off in the final days of the war, leaving a scar that was, in its own way, just as identifying. Others removed their tunics, hid in regular Wehrmacht uniforms, and tried to pass as ordinary soldiers. Some succeeded, many did not. The legal status of captured SS men was a problem the Allies had not fully worked out before the surrender. Under the Geneva Convention, captured combatants were entitled to prisoner of war status with specific protections. The American command in occupied Germany, however, developed a category called Disarmed Enemy Forces, or DEF, which placed surrendered Germans outside the protections of the convention. Waffen-SS members were generally placed in this category. The conditions inside DEF camps during the summer of 1945 were severe. Food was minimal. Shelter was often only a hole dug in the ground covered with a blanket. Estimates of deaths in American-run DEF and Rheinwiesenlager camps range widely, with German historians offering higher numbers and American historians lower ones. The actual figure is probably somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 deaths during the worst months of mid-1945, though the controversial work of James Bach proposed far higher numbers that have not been accepted by mainstream historians. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November of 1945, set the legal frame within which the Waffen-SS would be judged. The prosecution sought to have several organizations within the Nazi state declared criminal organizations, meaning that membership alone would constitute a punishable offense. The Gestapo, the SD, and the SS Leadership Corps were all charged in this way. The Waffen-SS was specifically included. The defense argued that the Waffen-SS had been a military formation rather than a political one, and that many of its members, particularly the foreign volunteers and the later conscripts, had not known of or participated in the crimes committed by other branches of the SS. The tribunal accepted parts of this argument, but not the whole. In its judgment of October 1, 1946, it declared the SS, including the Waffen-SS, a criminal organization. It exempted, however, those who had been conscripted by the state with no choice in the matter, and those who had committed no crimes. This narrow exemption would prove to be the legal door through which a great many former Waffen-SS men later walked back into civilian life. The practical effect of the criminal organization ruling was that any man who had served in the Waffen-SS could be required to face a denazification proceeding to determine whether he fell into the exempted category or into the criminal one. These proceedings, which the Allies handed over to German civilian authorities from 1946 onward, became the central mechanism for sorting the surviving Waffen-SS population. Each man was assigned to one of 5 categories, ranging from major offender at the top to exonerated at the bottom. The categories carried different consequences, from imprisonment and asset seizure for the worst offenders to fines and employment restrictions for the lighter cases, to nothing at all for those declared exonerated. The denazification process was uneven, often corrupt, and progressively softened as the years passed. In the American zone, more than 3 million cases were opened. The vast majority ended in light categorization. In the British zone, the process was more limited from the start. In the French zone, it was applied with greater severity in some areas and almost ignored in others. By 1948, with the Cold War sharpening Western priorities, the political will to pursue large numbers of former Waffen-SS men through the courts had largely evaporated. The new West German state, founded in 1949, took over the remaining cases and brought most of them to quick conclusion. A great many former Waffen-SS men, perhaps the largest single group of the post-war survivors, simply returned to civilian life in the years between 1946 and 1950. They went back to towns and villages, took up trades, married, and aged into the new Federal Republic. Their service was a private matter, sometimes acknowledged among trusted friends, often hidden from children and neighbors. Survey work done by German historians in the 1980s and 1990s found that most surviving Waffen-SS veterans had reintegrated into ordinary life without any further legal consequences, though many carried the psychological and physical injuries of the war into old age. The fate of those captured by Soviet forces was different in almost every respect. Estimates of the number of Waffen-SS men taken into Soviet captivity vary from around 70,000 to as many as 150,000, depending on which surrendering units are counted and how those handed over by the Western Allies are categorized. Soviet camps for SS prisoners were among the most severe in the system. Sentences of 25 years of labor were standard for Waffen-SS personnel. Mortality rates in the first 2 post-war winters were high. Of those who survived the initial period of captivity, many were not released until 1953, after Stalin's death. The last significant group of German prisoners returned from the Soviet Union in 1955 and 1956, after the visit of Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to Moscow. Among them were several thousand former Waffen-SS men who had been in Soviet hands for more than a decade. The foreign volunteers of the Waffen-SS faced perhaps the most complicated post-war reckoning of all. They were citizens of countries that had been occupied by Germany and that, in 1945, had every reason to treat military service in a German uniform as treason. The penalties varied enormously by country. In the Netherlands, more than 25,000 Dutchmen had served in the Waffen-SS at various times, and most were prosecuted after the war for collaboration. Sentences ranged from a few years of imprisonment to, in a small number of cases, execution. Most were released within a decade. In Belgium, the Flemish and Walloon volunteers received similar treatment. In Norway and Denmark, those who had served in the Nordland or other Scandinavian formations faced prosecution under collaboration laws, and most served prison terms of varying length. France was a particularly complicated case. The Charlemagne division had recruited French volunteers from the Vichy years onward and had been one of the last formations to defend the Reichstag in the final days of Berlin. The survivors who reached French custody were tried for treason. Some were executed. Many received long prison sentences. A smaller number escaped into Spain, North Africa, or further afield. The Latvians and Estonians who had served in the Waffen-SS faced a different problem entirely. Their countries had been annexed by the Soviet Union, and Soviet authorities considered them traitors, regardless of the circumstances of their enlistment. Many were deported to labor camps in Siberia. Others fought on in the forests of the Baltic as partisans into the early 1950s, in what is sometimes called the Forest Brothers Resistance. The Ukrainian, Cossack, and other Eastern European volunteers faced perhaps the harshest fate. Under the agreements reached at Yalta, all Soviet citizens captured in German uniform were to be returned to Soviet custody regardless of their wishes. The British Army carried out the most controversial of these transfers in southern Austria in May and June of 1945, handing over tens of thousands of Cossacks, including women and children of families that had fled the Soviet Union years earlier. Many were executed within weeks of their transfer. Others vanished into the camps of the Gulag system. Only a fraction were ever heard from again. Set against this scale of accountability, the persistent legend of mass escape and underground networks looms larger than the reality. The most famous of these is the so-called Odessa, an acronym attributed to a phrase meaning Organization of Former SS Members. The story of Odessa as a coordinated underground network, smuggling Waffen-SS officers to safety in South America, was popularized in the 1970s by the novelist Frederick Forsyth in his book The Odessa File. The Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal believed in the existence of Odessa and wrote about it in several of his books. The story has been part of popular imagination ever since. The historical reality is more complicated. There were certainly networks that helped former Nazis, including some Waffen-SS men, escape Europe in the immediate post-war years. These networks have been studied in detail by historians, including Gerald Steinecker, Uki Gonyi, and others. What they describe is not a single coordinated organization, but a loose constellation of individuals and institutions that cooperated in different combinations for different purposes. Sympathetic clergy within the Vatican, particularly Bishop Alois Hudal in Rome, and certain officials within the Pontifical Commission of Assistance, helped some fugitives obtain documents. The International Committee of the Red Cross issued travel papers, the so-called Red Cross passports, to displaced persons on the basis of often unverified information, and many former SS men obtained such documents under false names. Argentina, under the government of Juan Perón, operated an active recruitment program for European technical experts and military veterans through the late 1940s, and a number of former Waffen-SS officers reached Buenos Aires under this program. Within this loose network of escape routes, the Italian port of Genoa held a particular importance. From late 1946 through 1949, a steady flow of fugitives moved south through the Alps into northern Italy, made contact with sympathetic clergy in monasteries near the Brenner Pass and along the Adige Valley, and arrived in Genoa with documents that allowed them to board ships bound for Buenos Aires, Montevideo, or Asunción. The South Tyrol region, with its German-speaking population and its complicated post-war status, provided cover for the early stages of these journeys, and researchers have since traced specific routes through the towns of Merano and Bolzano. The total number of Waffen-SS members who escaped Europe through these various routes is not large compared to the total survivor population. The best estimates from current scholarship suggest that several hundred to perhaps a few thousand former SS personnel of all kinds, including Waffen-SS, reached South America or the Middle East through ratline routes in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The figure is significant, but far smaller than the popular image suggests. The great majority of surviving Waffen-SS men, perhaps 95% or more, did not escape, did not change their identities, and did not disappear. They were processed through prisoner of war camps, screened, categorized, and returned to civilian life within the borders of post-war Europe. The men who did escape have been the subject of decades of investigation. Some, like Adolf Eichmann, who was technically a member of the SS General Organization rather than the Waffen-SS proper, were eventually traced and captured. Eichmann was taken from Argentina by Israeli operatives in 1960 and tried in Jerusalem the following year. Others, like Josef Mengele, evaded capture until their natural deaths. Klaus Barbie, who had served in the SS security apparatus, was eventually extradited from Bolivia to France in 1983. The hunts for these men, conducted by national prosecutors, by the Israeli Mossad, by independent researchers like Beate and Serge Klarsfeld, and by figures like Wiesenthal himself, produced a steady trickle of arrests and trials across the second half of the 20th century. For the much larger group of Waffen-SS men who remained in Europe, the post-war trajectory often led back into uniform. The French Foreign Legion accepted a substantial number of former German soldiers, including former Waffen-SS men, into its ranks in the late 1940s. The Legion's tradition of not asking questions about a recruit's past made it an attractive option for men who wanted to leave Germany and start again. Many of these veterans fought in Indochina, where the First Indochina War was consuming French manpower at a rate the Legion could not easily replace. Casualties at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 included a significant number of former German soldiers, though the precise numbers have never been fully established because the Legion's records on national origin are deliberately incomplete. The new West German Army, the Bundeswehr, established in 1955, faced a different problem. The country needed trained officers and non-commissioned officers, and the only large pool of such men available was the surviving population of former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS veterans. The political question was which of them could be accepted. The Bundeswehr's founding charter explicitly excluded former members of the SS from senior positions, and the Personnel Examination Committee was established to screen candidates for past conduct. In practice, the line was drawn at the level of major or above. Junior officers and NCOs from the Waffen-SS could be considered if their service records contained no evidence of war crimes. Several thousand former Waffen-SS men served in the Bundeswehr through the 1950s and 1960s, the majority in junior positions, a smaller number rising into middle ranks. The East German military, the National People's Army, took a different approach in name and a similar one in practice. The official ideology of the German Democratic Republic was anti-fascist, and former members of the Waffen-SS were officially barred from service. In reality, the East German state, like the West German one, needed military expertise, and a quiet recruitment of suitable former soldiers took place. Several historians, including those who worked with the Stasi archives after 1990, have documented cases of former Waffen-SS men who served the East German state in various security and military capacities under new identities or with their pasts officially overlooked. The reintegration of Waffen-SS veterans into post-war German society found a more visible expression in the founding of the Hayag in 1951. The full name was the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, which translates roughly as the Mutual Aid Association of the former members of the Waffen-SS. The organization presented itself publicly as a veterans association concerned with the welfare of its members, the recovery of pension rights, and the rehabilitation of the Waffen-SS reputation. Its leadership argued, in line with the Nuremberg defense, that the Waffen-SS had been a normal military formation, the fourth branch of the German armed forces, and that its members had been ordinary soldiers rather than ideological criminals. This argument, sometimes called the Clean Waffen-SS thesis, was politically successful for a time. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Hayag had relationships with mainstream German political parties, particularly within the Free Democratic Party, and parts of the Christian Democratic Union. Its journals and publications reached a substantial readership. Its annual meetings drew thousands of attendees. The organization claimed to represent the interests of veterans who had been unfairly stigmatized for their service. The historical revision that Hayek promoted began to break down from the late 1960s onward, as a new generation of German historians, journalists, and prosecutors began to publish detailed studies of Waffen-SS conduct during the war. The participation of Waffen-SS divisions in massacres on the Eastern Front, the role of Waffen-SS units in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, the killings carried out by the Das Reich division at Oradour-sur-Glane and Tulle in France in 1944, the role of SS personnel in guarding concentration camps, all of these came under sustained investigation. By the 1980s, Hayek's public influence had collapsed. The organization formally dissolved its national leadership in 1992, though some regional groups continued in reduced form for years afterward. The accounting of where the 900,000 went, when it is set out in numbers, can be summarized in approximate terms. Of the men under arms in the Waffen-SS in the first months of 1945, somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000 are believed to have died in the final months of the war, in the Berlin and Vienna offensives, in the Courland pocket, in the Western defensive battles, and in the chaos of the surrender. Another 100,000 or so died in captivity, particularly in Soviet camps during the first post-war winters. Around 500,000 to 600,000 survived to be processed through denazification and to return eventually to civilian life. Of these, the great majority lived out their lives in Germany or in their countries of origin, ordinary men in many respects, marked privately by what they had done and seen. A smaller fraction served on in the Bundeswehr, in the French Foreign Legion, in other military forces around the world. Several thousand emigrated to North or South America through legitimate immigration programs, particularly after the relaxation of refugee restrictions in the late 1940s. A few hundred, to perhaps a few thousand, made use of the ratline networks to escape under false identities. A still smaller number became fugitives hunted by national prosecutors and private investigators for the rest of their lives. The arithmetic does not quite balance because the records were never complete and because the boundary between Waffen-SS service and other forms of wartime activity was sometimes blurred. The disappearance of the 900,000, in other words, is mostly the story of an enormous bureaucratic dispersal rather than a great vanishing into the underground. What the popular imagination has done with this material in books, in films, in conspiracy theories, has often been to inflate the small fraction at the expense of the large one. The Waffen-SS man living quietly in a small West German town, working as a mechanic or a clerk into the 1980s, does not make a good story. The Waffen-SS officer running an underground network from a hacienda in Paraguay does. The historical record, when it is examined carefully, supports the first picture far more than the second. The men who vanished into the everyday were always the great majority. The men who vanished into the legend were always the few. The final accounting also requires acknowledging what was not done. The denazification process was, in the judgment of most modern historians, insufficient. The number of Waffen-SS personnel prosecuted for war crimes was a tiny fraction of those who had served in units that had committed such crimes. The records of mass killings, of reprisals against civilians, of the treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front would have supported far more prosecutions than were ever brought. The political pressures of the early Cold War, the practical limits of judicial resources, the active interest of Western intelligence services in recruiting former German specialists all worked against a thorough reckoning. The trials that did occur at Nuremberg and afterward established a record. They did not exhaust the responsibility that the record described. The men of the Waffen-SS who survived into old age died, for the most part, in beds in German hospitals and nursing homes in the years between 1990 and 2020. The last large cohort, those who had been teenagers conscripted into the final formations of 1944 and 1945, are now in their late 90s. Within a few years, there will be no living members of the organization left. What remains will be the documents, the trials, the survivor testimonies, the academic studies, and the long argument over how this particular military formation should be remembered. The answer to where the 900,000 went, in the end, is that most of them did not go anywhere remarkable. They went home, when they had homes to return to, and lived ordinary lives shadowed by extraordinary experience. The great vanishing of the Waffen-SS was not into South American jungles or into secret bases under the ice. It was into kitchens and workshops, into pension offices and parish churches, into the slow business of post-war German life. The few who chose the more dramatic path of flight and false identity have left the better story. The many who chose silence and return have left the more accurate one. Both pictures taken together are what the historical record can offer us, and they are what we are left with as the last witnesses to those years finally pass.